For 2,000 years, there's been a gaping hole in the most famous story ever told. It's a silence right at the heart of the world's largest faith, an 18-year gap in the life of Jesus Christ. The Gospels, we all know, tell us he was a boy of 12, dazzling the elders in the temple. Then, poof! Almost 2 decades vanish, and he reappears as a man of 30, ready to launch a ministry that would change the world. So what happened? The mainstream suggestion is that he lived a quiet, unremarkable life as a carpenter in Nazareth. But what if that's not the whole story? The man who challenged an empire and upended religious authority didn't just wake up one day and decide to start a revolution. Something had to have happened in those missing years. And what if the key to unlocking this mystery isn't buried in the sands of Jerusalem or locked away in the Vatican? What if the answers have been hiding in plain sight, preserved for centuries, high in the mountains of Africa? For centuries, the story of Jesus has been told through the lens of Rome and Jerusalem. But one of the world's oldest and most expansive biblical canons doesn't come from Europe or the Middle East. It comes from Ethiopia. This Bible contains 81 books, a significant jump from the 66 in the standard Protestant Bible. It was preserved in a nation that famously resisted long-term European colonization, allowing its ancient traditions to develop on a unique path. These texts, written in the ancient Ge'ez language, include books that were lost to the Western world, books that early Christians read but were later excluded from the Western canon, and they start to fill in some of the blanks. They hint at a different story, one with prophecies the West forgot and a deep connection to the African continent. This isn't just a story about missing years, it's about a hidden history and a perspective on Jesus the world has yet to fully know. What astonishing secrets does Ethiopia's Bible reveal? To really get the importance of what Ethiopia preserved, you have to understand just how unique its Bible is. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, officially founded as a state church in the 4th century, traces its spiritual roots back to the apostolic age. Their Bible isn't just a book. It's a time capsule. While church councils in the West, like Nicaea and others, debated which books were in and which were out, Ethiopia was developing on its own trajectory, safeguarding a wider library of sacred writings. Their broader canon includes books like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees texts that were once hugely influential in early Christian and Jewish thought, but were eventually set aside as non-canonical by Western churches. The Book of Enoch, for instance, is actually quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. Some early church fathers, like Tertullian, held it in high regard. And yet, it vanished from the Western canon, only to be preserved in its entirety in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Little Genesis, retells stories from Genesis and Exodus and lays out a unique divine calendar. The survival of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't an accident. It was a conscious act of preservation. This community, partially isolated by geography and politics, held on to a version of the faith that was in many ways more ancient in its collection of literature than what was solidifying. In Rome, they didn't edit their history to fit a new political narrative. They preserved it. And within these preserved texts, that 18-year silence in Jesus' life begins to get a little louder. The silence of the canonical Gospels about Jesus' youth is deafening. But in Ethiopian tradition, that silence is filled with stories of a child who is anything but ordinary. Not part of the official 81-book canon. Apocryphal texts like the infancy Gospel of Thomas were known and preserved in Ethiopia, and their stories became part of a vibrant cultural tradition. These aren't the quiet, unassuming years of a simple carpenter. They tell of a young Jesus aware of his divine nature. One famous account describes a 5-year-old Jesus playing by a stream. He gathers some clay and molds it into 12 sparrows. Then, he claps his hands and commands the clay birds to fly. And they do. They reportedly take wing and soar into the sky. This story, while apocryphal, is seen in Ethiopian tradition as a powerful symbol. The one who would later offer spiritual life had the power to create physical life from dust. In another story, his earthly father, Joseph the carpenter, badly injures his hand. The young Jesus calmly takes Joseph's hand and, in an instant, heals it completely. These accounts, revered in Ethiopian cultural tradition, challenge the common notion that Jesus' power only appeared at his baptism. They suggest a messianic consciousness that was there from the beginning. While some stories show a child struggling to control immense power, they were viewed in these traditions as part of the sacred memory of the Messiah. So why were these stories, so rich with detail, left out of the Western Bible? Was it because they portrayed a Jesus who was too powerful, too mysterious, too difficult to neatly define? The traditions preserved in Ethiopia suggest the story of Jesus is far more complex than we've been led to believe. What we're uncovering here is a narrative that has been on the margins for centuries, a story preserved in a place the world often overlooked. It makes you wonder, what else have we missed? If these traditions change how we see Jesus' childhood, what else could the Ethiopian perspective reveal about his identity and mission? Before we go any further, if you're finding this look into hidden history as fascinating as I do, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon. We're all about digging up the stories that have been buried. And let me know in the comments, have you ever heard these stories of Jesus' childhood before? What do you think they mean? Perhaps the most startling insight from the Ethiopian tradition isn't just about what Jesus did but who he was . For centuries, Western art has given us a single image of Jesus: fair skin, light hair, European features. It's so pervasive, it's the only Jesus many have ever known. But in the ancient churches of Ethiopia, a very different image has been preserved for centuries. Here, Jesus is often depicted as one of their own, with dark skin, broad features, and woolly hair. This isn't a modern political statement. It's an ancient artistic and theological tradition reflecting a deep connection. It's not just about skin color. It's about identity. The story starts with the flight to Egypt. In Matthew's Gospel, Joseph is warned in a dream to take Mary and the infant Jesus to Egypt to escape King Herod. In many Western readings, this is a brief detour. But in the Ethiopian tradition, it's a pivotal event. Egypt is in North Africa. For the Holy Family to seek refuge there, to blend in, suggests they looked more like the locals than like European foreigners. Jesus spent part of his early infancy not in Galilee, but in an African nation. The Ethiopian tradition sees this as a fulfillment of prophecy. Africa, once the land of Israel's slavery, became the Messiah's sanctuary. This act forever weaves the continent of Africa into Jesus' life story. And the connections don't stop there. Think of Simon of Cyrene, the man compelled to help Jesus carry his cross. Cyrene was in modern-day Libya. Simon was an African man. Then there's the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, a high-ranking official from the court of the Queen of Ethiopia. He is converted by the Apostle Philip, becoming one of the very first non-Jewish followers of Jesus, and according to tradition, bringing that faith back to Africa. The Ethiopian tradition presents a narrative where Africa isn't on the sidelines of the salvation story, but woven into its very fabric. It gives us a Jesus who is not a white European, but a Middle Eastern man with undeniable roots and connections to the African continent, challenging us to rethink the very geography of our faith. The unique books in the Ethiopian biblical canon don't just add stories. They provide a deeper, more mystical context for Jesus' entire mission. They contain prophecies that were foundational to how many early Christians understood the Messiah, but which were later set aside by the West. The most significant is the Book of Enoch, preserved in its complete form only in Ethiopia's Ge'ez language. The book is filled with visions of heaven, angels, the origin of evil, and prophecies of a coming figure called the Son of Man. Enoch speaks of a pre-existent Son of Man who was named before the sun and stars were created, which directly parallels the language in the Gospel of John about the Word being with God in the beginning. Jesus himself used the title Son of Man to describe himself more than any other. For those who lost the Book of Enoch, that title can seem a bit vague, but when read through the lens of the Ethiopian canon, it becomes a powerful messianic title packed with prophetic meaning. To the Ethiopian church, these are direct prophecies Jesus knew and fulfilled. Then there's the Ascension of Isaiah, another ancient text preserved in Ethiopia. It describes a vision where Isaiah is taken through the 7 heavens and sees the future. He witnesses the beloved Christ descend from heaven, disguising himself as he passes through each angelic realm until he is born on earth. The text vividly portrays the crucifixion, not as a defeat, but as a strategic victory over the angel of death. These prophecies do more than add detail. They create a theological bedrock for Jesus' identity, showing his arrival as the culmination of a divine story that had been unfolding since the dawn of time. A story meticulously preserved in the sacred books of Ethiopia. If this history is so rich, why is this the first time many of us are hearing about it? The answer is a complicated story of theology, power, and politics. Aha! The narrative preserved in Ethiopia wasn't lost by accident. In many ways, it was sidelined. The split began in the 5th century. At the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, a huge debate over Christ's nature erupted. The Western and Byzantine churches adopted a view that Jesus had two separate natures, one divine, one human. The churches of Egypt and Ethiopia, however, held to a Miaphysite view, encapsulated in the Ge'ez word asterisk, Tewahedo asterisk, meaning unified. They insisted Jesus's divine and human natures were perfectly united into a single nature. This sounds like splitting hairs, but the fallout was massive. The Ethiopian Church and other Oriental Orthodox churches were labeled as heretics by Rome and Constantinople, creating a schism that isolated them for over 1,500 years. Later, during the colonial era, this was compounded by cultural prejudice. European missionaries often saw Ethiopian Christianity as a strange, corrupted version of the faith, not an authentic, ancient tradition. They looked at the dark-skinned depictions of Jesus not as a valid cultural expression, but as an error. They dismissed the extra books in their Bible as folklore. The very survival of the Ethiopian canon is a testament to its people's resilience. Ethiopia, along with Liberia, is notable for being one of two African nations that avoided long-term European colonization. This independence military, cultural, and spiritually allowed the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church to protect its sacred texts, art, and traditions, including their sacred belief that they have preserved the Ark of the Covenant. They held on to a story of Jesus that much of the world was leaving behind. Today, scholars are turning back to the Ethiopian canon, not as a curiosity, but as an essential source. They are challenging the Eurocentric narrative and rediscovering a Jesus who isn't confined to one culture. The suppression of this narrative was a loss for the whole world. But its rediscovery is a chance to see our shared history with new eyes. We started with a mystery, an 18-year silence in the life of Jesus. But the journey into Ethiopia's traditions reveals that the silence was only in one part of the world. In the highlands of Africa, the story was never lost. It was being told, painted, and prayed. We've discovered traditional stories of a young Jesus of immense power, shaping clay birds into living creatures. We've seen a Jesus whose identity is deeply rooted in the African continent, a refugee in Egypt who found safety among its people. We've uncovered lost prophecies from books like Enoch that give cosmic weight to his mission. The Ethiopian perspective doesn't just offer a few new stories, it presents a fundamental challenge. It gives us a Jesus who is not a product of Europe, but a global figure whose story is deeply intertwined with Africa. It challenges the whitewashed images that have dominated Western culture and invites us to embrace a richer, more complex understanding of the Son of Man. The story preserved in Ethiopia is a powerful reminder that no single culture owns the story of God, and that some truths are too vital to remain hidden forever. The missing years weren't an empty space. They were simply waiting for the world to listen to the voices from Africa. The question is, now that we've heard them, how will it change the story we tell? The history of our world is full of hidden chapters. If this journey into a forgotten story has opened your eyes, please share this video with someone who needs to see it. For more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history and faith, make sure you're subscribed. Click on the screen now to watch another of our investigations into the mysteries of the ancient world. Thanks for watching.